Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, the day after the big election, although it's kind of still happening as votes are tallied and nails are chewed. And so you guys have been paying attention to? Yeah.
Watching all night.
All night?
Yeah.
What? Election? Yeah, we're having one. They're having one of those. Yeah.
Why did they close down all the stores?
Why did they close down all the stores?
They barricaded them, or
Yeah, I think some people in some places were worried that there might be riots if the election didn't turn out the way that they wanted it to. What's that?
I see 2 mics.
Well, yeah, because this is what's streaming to the internet right now. Do you want to come? Do you want to come and be on TV?
I'll say a quick hello. There's like a million people watching. Hello, people. Hello.
There's Gordon and Zerlinda
Hello.
visiting our class today.
Online.
Who's online?
Adalbert.
This lovely group of people.
Clara, Nikki. Hi,
I don't know.
Gabrielle.
Just
Hi,
class right
Hannah.
now?
yes.
We're currently crashing
You're
class.
streaming live to the
Hi,
internet.
Daniel. Hi,
Okay,
Miles.
that's all.
Bye-bye.
That's it? You're not gonna say anything more?
What did I say?
I don't know.
Oh, you should all come to school on Friday because we're having a pizza party, and if you don't come, no pizza for you.
Ooh.
Free pizza.
Bye.
Good message. All right. That was fun. Right, so George's question was why were they boarding up businesses? Some people were a little bit worried that there might be riots or violence or looting if the election didn't go one way or the other. It seems that really didn't happen, so it was a pretty quiet night, at least. About the outcome? It's true. Any it is divided. This is
Biden's gonna win. He's winning right now.
this is what it looks like so far.
I don't know what they're gonna do.
It was like 2-5 before I left the house, and then Trump was 2-13.
Yeah, it's some people were saying that what would probably happen is as the mail-in votes got counted, Biden would pick up more votes because more Trump supporters were likely to vote in person and more Biden supporters were more likely to mail in their ballots. But you never know how that's going to turn out, and so things are trickling in. It looks pretty good for Handsome Joe so far, but you know, we'll never know until all the polls report in, right?
17 million. That's a lot.
Huh?
70 million. That's a lot.
Yeah. So 70 million votes have been cast for Biden and 67 million for Trump.
But that's like popular vote. It's all from California, so it doesn't matter that much.
Well, and indeed, I don't know. and indeed, the popular vote doesn't really matter, right? So it's sometimes it's interesting to know how many people voted for Biden or Trump, and as you can see here, it's really not that far apart, but you know, it doesn't make a difference. What? I think it's going to go to Biden.
No, but if Trump win either Michigan or Wisconsin, like Biden lose. Either that Tuesday, Biden lose.
Yeah, it's tough to know which way it's going to go until it's done. And usually on election night, because so few people normally mail in their ballots, you can get a winner that night. But because of coronavirus, it's a different election, and so there's lots of mail-in stuff to count. And so, like I say, we'll just watch and bite our nails and until we have the final tally, right?
Millions of people depend on the election, some undocumented immigrants in the United States.
Arguably,
Yeah.
if the United States is, this might be a controversial claim. I don't have supporting premises for this ready, but if not the most significant country in the world, at least one of the 3 or 4, right? So what happens in the United States does have an effect, will have an effect on everyone else. Certainly on us here in Canada because we're right next door. They're our closest ally. They're our biggest trading partner. Whatever happens there certainly affects us here. But in terms of, you know, on the global stage, maybe dealing with Russia or interacting with China, you know, the U.S. is going to play a major role in that. And so whoever winds up in the White House is going to affect all of our lives in one way or another. Maybe directly, maybe indirectly, but it's obviously not just the Americans watching this one. It's everyone is watching this one, right? Okay, anything else you want to say about politics, the election?
Where's Trump right now? Because Biden is in Delaware, right?
Biden's in Delaware. Trump is probably at the White House, I think. I think he's
No, he's in somewhere else.
he's
Not in New York.
what's that?
Is he not in New York?
He seems to bounce around from, like, he's the White House and then to New York and then to his Mar-a-Lago place in Florida. He sort of bounces around quite a bit, and so, you know, his home state is New York, so he might have gone there, or he might be at the White House.
Yeah, but New York vote for Biden.
They did vote for Biden pretty overwhelmingly. That Senate race is still tied neck and neck. That's interesting. Wonder what's going on. Does anyone know how many seats in the U.S. Senate? Does anyone know?
51.
50 some?
No. There's more than that because there's 80. There's 94. There's 94 listed there.
101.
101?
Yeah.
Okay.
51.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Enough about that. Let's talk about something much less contentious. Racism. So yesterday we started off by I asked you a bunch of questions, right, about what race is and what race you are and who gets to say which race you are and can you change and does race kind of mean anything or not? Okay, and we had a few thoughts about some of those things. We had some ideas about what race is, and most of us, I think, might be able to identify where we fit in terms of a racial category. But yeah, let's explore this a little bit, okay? So first of all, I'll distinguish between these two, okay? So in kind of regular society, people, okay. In regular society, people don't often distinguish very well between race and ethnicity, right? And so, guys, they don't often distinguish between race and ethnicity, right? And so this is what we'll say that race is. So race is a social distinction, okay? It's a social construction, if you will. And it's based on what our eyes tell us, right? So might have to do with color of your skin, might have to do with the shape or color of your eyes or how your hair grows or sort of the general shape of your face or something like that. Those all contribute to people's classifications as one race or another, or the shape of your nose. All of those are kind of visual signals to people that they might want to categorize you in this race or in this race over here, right? And so, of course, I'm clearly white, and my skin color pretty much contributes to that, as maybe do my facial features. I don't have any facial features associated with any other races. I have blue eyes, which kind of helps. And so, yeah, I'm white, right? At least as most people would see me. Ethnicity is something different, right? So your ethnicity is kind of rooted in your culture or your language or your religion or a shared history amongst your people, right? And so, again, to some degree, this is kind of socially constructed as well, but we were kind of talking about that, Avera, we were talking about that with you yesterday where, you have sort of a cultural ethnic heritage in China, right? So there's kind of a Chinese-ness about you or about your family culturally, even though you live in Singapore and you're parents were born in Singapore and so were you, right? So there's kind of a Chinese ethnicity there that connects you to kind of a broader cultural tradition, if you will. Does that make sense? Yeah. So ethnicity is a little bit different from race, right? Because of course that has to do with culture and yeah. Okay, so these are two different things. And yesterday I think the only other thing that came up was nationality, right? And so nationality is kind of just the nation or the country that you belong to, right? And so for me, I'm Canadian. I was born here, and Canadian is not is a nationality, right? It's not necessarily an ethnicity, I don't think. Canada is such a varied place that I don't feel like we have a very strong, unified Canadian culture. To some degree, I think we do. I think there's some things that we share. But then sometimes it's hard to know, right? When you're kind of looking at your own culture, it's hard to know what's cultural, right? Sometimes it's easier to see cultural things in contrast to your own. But I think there's some form of Canadian culture here, which I would say I belong to. But also I have, if you go back a few generations, my ancestors come from England and from Ireland. And so there's certainly kind of there's a little bit of an ethnicity or a cultural heritage there, which is not strong, but I can point out certain things about how my family works that are connected with those cultures. Okay, so that's kind of an earlier ethnicity, I guess, for me, but sometimes it's difficult to categorize, right? So again, we often think about race in biological terms, but again, the question is this true, right? Is race a biological thing, or is it not? Or to what degree is it a biological thing, right? I just told you it was a social distinction, but I think we all intuitively know that there's some biology at play here as well, right? My skin is this color because of my biology, right? It's because of how my physical body works. So there is a biological element, but what's the biological piece? So, of course, hopefully we all know that humans are organisms, right? Yes, we're living creatures, yes, which are kind of encoded, our bodies and our physiological processes are encoded by DNA, right? And so there are a lot of, sorry, just give me a second here. There are a huge number, that's okay. Jeez, Nav, come on. I'm trying to teach a class on race here, Nav. Okay. So there are a huge number, as you can see, of human genes, right? And our genes are the things that biologically encode how our body looks and how it works, right? And so everything from your eye color to your hair color to how you digest starches to, the degree of body fat you carry to, the way your teeth grow, all kinds of different things are encoded in your genetics, right? And of course, your genetics are passed on from your parents. You get about half your genes from mom, half your genes from dad. They combine in a unique way, and you wind up with a completely unique organism, right? And so humans here have 23 chromosomes, as you can see them here. I don't think I have anything else smart to say about that. I think that's just, what's that?
What is this?
What is this? This is kind of a simplified schematic of the 23 chromosomes that make up the human genome.
Some people have extra or less.
Some people have extra or less, it's true. Very rarely. Most of us look like this. And you can see here that you have either an X and a Y or an X and an X down there, right? And so we talked about that in the sexism unit. So if you're biologically female or biologically male, if you're male, you have an X and a Y. The Y is just a little one there, which is kind of funny. And 2 X's if you're a female, right?
The YY.
What's that?
What's a YY?
What's a YY? I don't think it exists.
Alien.
So based on the genetic evidence that we have now, because of course we're living in a time in history where science can sequence entire genomes, right? And we can read everybody's genetic code in this room with the proper test. And so what genetic evidence has actually shown us is that the things that we see, the sort of characteristics that we associate with race, do not actually define races in humans, okay? Races are a thing in biology, okay? So you can have races of organisms, but usually what happens with a race is that a race is kind of separated from the main population, okay? So if I took, oh gosh, I don't know, let's say I took raccoons. Have you seen raccoons here? Yeah. Great. They're so bad? They smell? Well, they do eat garbage. Let's say I took a bunch of these raccoons, okay? And so I collected, I don't know, 40 raccoons, and I put them all in a big bag, and I took them off to an island, and I dropped them on the island, and there was enough food for them on the island, but they couldn't get back to the mainland, okay? So over time, this group of raccoons would slowly evolve, and they would evolve differently from the raccoons here in Vancouver. As they became more and more different, eventually they would constitute their own race, and eventually they would evolve into their own species of raccoon, right? And so a race is something that is kind of a group of animals that are kind of on their way to a different species, right? They've diverged from the main population and they're becoming something different. But of course they have to be isolated in order to do that, right? You can't have my island raccoons interbreeding with my mainland raccoons, right? Because then their genetics will get mixed up and then they'll be just the same, right? You'll just have raccoons everywhere. So I need to genetically separate my island raccoons and then let them evolve for thousands and thousands of years, and eventually they will become their own race of raccoons and maybe eventually their own species. So that's a real thing for biology and for organisms, but the problem for humans is that we've never really done that. We've never really been good at isolating ourselves. Humans have always migrated around, we've always traveled, we've always traded with other cultures, we've always sailed off to see, what's beyond the horizon. Humans are very mobile, and when we encounter other humans, things tend to happen in which our genes get mixed, right? So really no populations of humans have ever been isolated, and so there really are no biological races in terms of humans. In terms of humans, we're basically all one race, to the point where many genetic scientists have suggested that there's more genetic variability within a race than between them, okay? And so who's a good example here? Who's from Vietnam here? Vietnam? Anybody? Huh? And, okay, so if we take, so who's from Vietnam? Kang? Chan? Not Sam? Faye? Okay, so let's say we're going to take Faye and Kang here. Both of them are from Vietnam, and so I'm going to assume that your relatives and your ancestors are roughly from that area in Vietnam, give or take, okay? What this means is that if we checked all of our DNA, so if we checked Kang's DNA, Faye's DNA, my DNA, my ancestors are from kind of Northern Europe. They've never been anywhere near Vietnam. But genetically speaking, I could be more like Faye or more like Kang than they could be like each other.
Why?
Because the things that we recognize, the traits that we mark as evidence of race, so hair color or face shape or skin color, you're really just talking about a few genes, right? And so those few genes are, again, they're just like a handful, but humans have so many genes that those actually don't make a difference, right? And so when I encounter someone who's from another race, I look at them with my eyes. Let's say I encounter a black person, and I say, wow, that's a big difference. This person is an entirely different color from me. You know, and so my eyes and my brain interpret that as a big difference. But genetically speaking, skin color is not that big of a difference. There's a few genes that regulate it in the vast, you know, in the vast scheme of the entire genome. And so we can vary in all sorts of different ways, but most of the ways in which we vary are not visible. And so really the things that mark us as members of a certain race are not that many genes control it. It's not that big of a difference genetically. And two, most of those things have to do simply with environmental adaptations. Okay? So does anyone know why my skin is this color? This is like from Mean Girls, right? Oh my God, you can't just ask people why they're white. Why am I white?
Because your parents were white.
Because my parents were white. But evolutionarily speaking, why am I white?
You don't need the same pigment as people in tropical countries to survive.
Why not?
Because they adapt to be more resistant to the heat, and you live in a country where there's like colder months where you don't need that much pigment.
Yeah, exactly. So my skin color and the skin color of people around the world is an adaptive trait, right? It has to do with sun exposure and it has to do with vitamin D production. So you need to get sunlight entering your skin. You need photons entering your skin in order for your body to synthesize vitamin D, okay? And so if you live close to the equator, or if you come from a country, if your ancestors come from a country close to the equator, that's no problem, right? You're getting tons of sun. What you need is a little bit of protection from it, right? So people whose ancestors are from close to the equator, they tend to be darker skinned, right? And that melanin in their skin is a protection from the UV light of the sun, right? But my ancestors come from Northern Europe, right? Where it's cold and cloudy and wet and gross, kind of like this. And so protection from the sun is not our problem, right? We actually need to get sunlight into our skin. And so over time, you get skin that is kind of transparent, right? And it lets a lot of the sun in. Of course, when we go on vacation to Mexico or whatever, we roast like lobsters as a result, right? But again, thousands of years ago, if you're living in a climate that's cool and not very sunny and wet and cold, this skin is great because it lets in that vitamin D. If you're living close to the equator, you need a skin that will protect you from the sun, right? So those things are adaptive traits, but again, they don't really signal any significant genetic difference between people. There's just a couple of genes that are passed on, right? And so again, it looks like a big difference to our eyes, right? It looks, when you see someone who's an entirely different color than you, your eyes and your brain say, wow, that's a big difference. But genetically speaking, not that big of a difference either, right? And the same can really be said of any of the other kind of physical markers that indicate races. So it could be how people's hair grows, or the shape of their nose, or their eyes, or their kind of general face shape. Any of those things, or skin color, any of those things are just controlled by a few genes. And when you put it in the context of the entire human genome, the entire DNA strand, they just don't make that much of a difference. They seem like a big difference to our eyes, but genetically speaking, not that big of a deal, right? But we do tend to inherit them from ancestral populations, right? So, you know, you can ask me, why am I white? And it's because my parents were white, and their parents were white, and all the way back, their parents came from a place where it was kind of cold and wet and not very sunny, right? And so that gene got passed down, and I still have it. But again, it's not that big of a difference, right? And so again, if you look in this room and if you compared all of our DNA, you would certainly see some things that come to us from our ancestral populations, right? You would see genes that have come to me from Northern Europe, right? There's going to be lots of genes in here that come from Southeast Asia, right? And some of them are going to be connected with certain physiological features. Some of them are not, right? Some of them are going to be things that you can't see. But generally speaking, when you compare all of those DNA strands, none of them are really different enough to constitute a different race, right? We're all the same race. We just have some adaptive differences that get passed on, right? But they're biologically speaking, with humans, there's no such thing as race. And really, there never has been, because humans have always moved around. And we've always interacted with each other. And when we interact with each other, usually there's sexy time. So, yeah, we've always been mixing our genes together for basically the entire history of humans. And so, again, genetically speaking, we're just not that different. Yeah, so the way that we define race based on hair or eyes or skin color or whatever it is, again, those are visual features, but they're pretty superficial in terms of genetic difference. And so, yeah, so I said that when we were talking about chimpanzees and bonobos, when we watched Christopher Ryan, chimpanzees share, I think, 98 or 99% of their DNA with us. And bonobos are even more similar. It's like 99.4. And so here, we as a species share 99.9% of our DNA with each other. So for all intents and purposes, we are exactly the same, right? There's no difference between you and me and anyone else in this room, genetically speaking. Yes, there are, but those differences are pretty minor. Yeah, so think about it in terms of, yeah, we have like 0.1% difference in our genetic codes, and so we share a lot of things, right? We are similar in a lot of ways, much more so than we are different. But that said, we also know that human societies classify people into racial categories, right? We know even from watching the US election over the past few days, we've heard, talking about black voters and Latino voters and, white voters and who's voting for who and who's not voting for who. And so very clearly societies divide people up based on how they look, right? Or where their ancestry has come from. And so even if race isn't biologically real or biologically significant, it is socially significant, right? Things that are socially constructed have power and have effects, right? Even if it's something as simple as, no wearing sweatpants on Monday, right? That was a ridiculous rule, but it had consequences for Regina. And similarly, when we construct race, when we socially construct an idea of race and give it meaning, that of course has significant consequences in society as well, right? So here, of course, in North America, the dominant group are white people, right? And so white people came here starting in about the 1500s, the early 1500s. They kind of came in and took over and used their wealth and weaponry to kind of subjugate First Nations populations and build an economy and build countries. And here we are with white people as the dominant group. And so usually the distinction we make here is between kind of white people and people of color, right? And you've probably heard people of color before, and in fact, I've probably said it in this class. And it's a bit of a general term which includes anyone who's not white, okay? And so it's not the best term because, of course, there's lots of different experiences and different people in that group, right? And so if you're living in the United States, for instance, you could be a person of color and be black, right? Be an African American. Or you could be Japanese. Or you could be an American Indian or a First Nations person or a South Asian person. All of those are kind of different cultures, right? They're connected to different ethnicities. They have different experiences, right? Being a black person in the US is not quite the same as being a South Asian person or being a First Nations person. And so it's kind of not a great idea, I guess, to sort of lump everybody in one category when they are different. But often we do talk about people of color as being everyone who's not white. Oh, good, and I have something for you to read. I bet you were hoping that, weren't you? Like, I hope he has something for us to read. I have an article for you to read on understanding racism. And so it's actually it's a great article because it talks a lot about what racism is, how it works in society, and a little bit about how race has been socially constructed. And it's very interesting how it's been constructed here in the US and here in the US, there in the US, and here in Canada. So, as you might have guessed, it is in Microsoft Teams, so I'll give you some time to start reading this. We'll take a break and then we'll come back to it, okay? It is in Microsoft Teams, right? It's I think it says FS-understanding racism or something. It's there? Okay, good. Woo. That was a close one. So, there it is. There's a bit to read. Well, some of those pages are just references, right? So you don't have to worry about that. So I'll do this. I'll put 37, I'll put 13 minutes on the clock so we can read and then we'll take a break, okay? There we go. Okay, good people. I know this is a dense article, but we'll we'll get through it. Huh?
Not finished.
No, you're not. I don't think you're not supposed to be. I'm not finished either. But we'll take a little break and then we'll come back to it. Okay? Okay, people, we are back. Maybe what I'll do is I'll give you another 13 minutes, and then we'll talk about kind of where we are. Okay, we'll start to answer questions, and then if we need more time to read, we'll figure it out. But let's do 13 minutes of reading, and then we'll answer the questions that we are able to answer at that point, if that makes sense. Also, before I let you, notice what a good job this paper does of citing their sources in the text, right? So you can see lots of brackets like, Essed and Goldberg, 2002, or Kiltsgaard, 1972. So you can see them doing the citations. So as you're reading, try to take, a few seconds here and there and pay attention to how they're doing those citations. So sometimes they're putting the author's name in the bracket if they don't mention it in the sentence. Sometimes they'll mention the names in the sentence, and then they'll just have the little the year in the brackets. But pay attention to how they do that, because you can imitate it. Not plagiarize it, but you can imitate it. Okay, good people. Can we talk about this one a little bit? No? Everyone's in a comatose state. Just out of curiosity, on a scale of 1 to 10, how easy was that article to read? 1 being super easy and 10 being super, super difficult. 9.9. Okay, what?
It's easy, but it's just long.
It's easy but long?
Yeah.
Okay. So the complexity level is where? 5? 4, 5? Somewhere in the middle? Yeah? 6 maybe? Anna, what did you think?
It was long.
You good but long?
It was good.
Okay, so kind of like 4, 5, 3, 4. Okay. Girls? Huh? It's all right? It's just like a textbook? Okay. Good to know. Yeah, it's okay. It's a little dense, I know, and maybe it's a little bit long, but that's okay. Sometimes it's good to stretch and do a little bit something more complicated, right? So you can see this article is very clearly written from the perspective of Canada and Canada's Indigenous people or First Nations, right? So there's a lot of what shows up in this article is kind of indirect reference to First Nations people's experience in Canada. And so if you know a little bit about that, then some of these things probably make sense to you and sort of remind you of things. If you don't know anything about Canada's First Nations people, some of it might be a little bit confusing, or you might not know what they're talking about. But I have a little bit of a thing that we can do, and we can talk about First Nations people in Canada a little bit later. So maybe some of the gaps will be filled in a little bit later this week, or maybe next week, okay? But first, so when and why did race as a social category or a category of identity emerge? So where does race come from? Or the idea of race?
1600.
About the 1600s in Europe? Okay, so what's going on? Why are they creating this social category?
They want to have like an identity or some sort like that. And it was probably defined by one's religion and language.
Okay, so in the past they're saying that prior to maybe 15 or 1600, race actually wasn't a thing, right? People were defined by the language they spoke, or the religion, the gods that they worshipped, or perhaps maybe the land that they came from. But here we have this new social category emerging. And why are people creating this new category?
Colonizing other continents, something that more ways to differentiate.
Yeah, so they were colonizing new countries, and so this is a period of colonization and expansion where mostly European powers are sailing around the globe, exploring, discovering new places for themselves, and then taking them over, right? And so we have different groups of people coming into contact, and there's this creation of race. What else is kind of behind this creation of race? Sorry? Domination? Yeah, and I think maybe that leads into the question 3 about the 1800s, but let's just kind of follow this through. So how do you mean domination there?
They wanted to be in charge, so they created these racial hierarchy and said that white people are superior and every other race is inferior.
Yeah. So people, whether they be European colonists or did you say ideologists? I don't think that's a thing, but it sounds good. So colonists or government leaders or explorers and scientists all started to work on this problem of race, right? And the idea is that they were in the process of creating a racial hierarchy, right? And surprise, surprise, the people who were creating the hierarchy found themselves at the top of the hierarchy, right? How surprising to look into the differences between races and unexpectedly find out that your race is the best, right? How interesting is that? But we know that's the case, right? Because we know that the dominant group often defines what's normal, right? And what's the default? And often they see themselves as superior. And so white people are creating these hierarchies, and they do exactly that, right? They put themselves at the top in terms of basically every category you can imagine. So, you know, the race that's the smartest, the most sophisticated, the most generous, the most brave, the most hardworking, whatever kind of good characteristic you want to imagine, white people amazingly had all of them, right? And then as you move down this racial hierarchy, people were thought to have different characters and different abilities, right? Should we say this now? Should I say this now? Maybe I will say this now. And those kind of ideas, as I say, scientists start to take them up. They start to investigate the differences between human races. They find differences between human races, although this is bad science. This is not well done science, and so it's bunk. It's garbage. But at the time, people believed it, and so and this was kind of the basis on which the U.S. and Canada are founded, right? If you know anything about the U.S. is founded on what is it called? What do they say? They say freedom and the pursuit of happiness for all, freedom, justice, and the pursuit of happiness for all, or something like that. Does that sound familiar? No? It is kind of something they say about the foundation of the U.S., right? Is that it's freedom and freedom from persecution, and you know, the ability to sort of live a free life and pursue happiness and your goals. But of course, that didn't apply to everyone, right? Because there were a lot of black people that had been brought to the United States, and they weren't going to get any of that freedom or happiness or independence or anything like that, right? They were going to get slavery. And so the question is, how do you form a country on the basis of freedom and equality and then deny those things to some people? And again, the way you do it is kind of by dehumanizing people, right? You make them less than you, so you don't feel so bad about denying them the sort of rights and privileges and benefits that you have in society. And so that's exactly what happened in the US, right? That race was a justification for the treatment of black Americans, or, well, they probably weren't Americans at the time, but from black Africans who were brought over to the New World in order to work, right? And so, again, they wouldn't be getting any of that freedom or equality or pursuit of happiness. And why? Well, the science said that they just weren't as good as white people. But maybe if black people worked really hard, maybe one day they could be as good as white people too, right? That was kind of it's ridiculous, right? It's all crazy stuff, but those were the kind of beliefs that were circulating at the time. And they justified differential treatment of people, right? It allowed white people in the US to keep the power and the money and the opportunity, and it justified why black people didn't have that thing, because they were less, because they were not as good. So there's an official ideology of race, at least in this article here. And what do they say the official ideology of race is? Is there 3 points to that one, or 5? Let me just remind myself here. There's 2? What's the official ideology of race? Okay, say that just a hair louder. You have the volume of a mouse.
Beliefs that racial differences, like there's racial differences in
Right. So the belief that there are differences, right? That human races exist, that there's different races, and each race has a different character, and you can tell what race someone belongs to by looking at them, right? So by looking at someone, you can tell what race they belong to, and based on that, you know something about them, right? What else is there tied up in this ideology of race? Gabrielle here says, she says racial categories are exclusive. They arise from nature and they are enduring. What does that mean? What's that? Yeah, you can't change them, right? So according to this belief, if Chinese people are a certain way, let's say, okay, so let's say that Chinese is a race or Asian is a race, and people have ideas about what Asian people are like, then if my girlfriend and I or my wife and I go to China and we adopt a little Chinese baby and we come back to Canada and we raise this little Chinese baby as our own, this theory says that, well, that baby will still act like a Chinese person in whatever that means, whatever that means in this ideology of race. So it won't really matter that this little baby grows up in Canada. It won't really matter that they are raised by the little baby is raised by two Canadians. This baby belongs to this race and therefore will exhibit whatever characteristics are attached to this race, right? Do you think that's true? Don't think so?
I think so.
You think so, yes?
It depends on where you grew up.
Depends on where you, yeah, I think it does too. I think it does too.
This is how you raise the baby. Like, if you raise the baby to know and you expose that kid to its cultural background, it will be different if you would raise the kid in, like, fully just Canadian way.
Yeah, and let's say I do that. Let's say, I don't really care about their Chinese heritage. I'm just going to raise them as a child in our house, and I'm not going to worry too much about their original ethnicity or ancestry. So yeah, will that baby act like whatever a Chinese person is supposed to act like? No, right? Of course not. But this belief says it does, right? This belief says there's something about the Chinese race or the Asian race, whatever it is, and that's biological, it's wired in, and you can't change it. So it doesn't matter if I adopt this Chinese baby and bring it back to Canada and raise it as my own, somehow they will still act or behave in the Chinese way. Whatever that is, right? whatever someone imagines that to be. And it's not true, right? We've talked about that, right? We said that humans are born with very little in terms of biological programming, right? We barely know how to eat on our own when we're born. We don't know how to walk. We don't know how to do anything. And so everything is taught to us. And so, yeah, this is something that this is an ideology of race, but there's really nothing behind it, right? So again, certain races of people don't have certain types of characteristics, right? Because that's just not how we're exactly wired, and B, because there aren't really any biological races anyway. So it doesn't work that way, right? My little Chinese baby, my daughter, let's say, she's gonna be raised as my daughter, right? She'll be a unique person because all people are, but she'll grow up here, right? And she won't. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. What else? Is there anything else to that ideology of race? What else is there?
The idea that there's a difference in intellectual capacity and moral character between.
Right. So not only does the ideology of race say that race exists, but different races have different intellectual capacities and different moral characters, right? So all people belonging to a race can be described as, you know, maybe super smart or maybe not very smart, or maybe lazy or melancholy, as they say in here. What does melancholy mean? Yeah, kind of sad, kind of mopey, or aggressive, or, you know, dishonest, or something like that. And can you do that? Can you apply that to entire groups of people? That's not true, right? You can't even do it with Canadians. Canadians have a stereotype of being polite, right? Sometimes overly polite. Are all Canadians polite? No. Some of us are jerks, right? Some of us are mostly polite, but then on some days we're jerks, right? So again, you can't do that for anything. You can't take an entire group of people and say, all this group of people are like this. And it's certainly not biological, right? There's nothing there. Okay, so some of these things are connected to these. I think there's now 5 beliefs of race-based societies. And what are they? I think there's like A, B, C, D, and E. What's A? A. Biology what?
Racial differences.
Right. So societies that think race is a thing and think race is important feel that racial differences originate in biology, right? Is that true? Just a little bit, right? In terms of the way that we classify people into races is based on biology, right? If we're going to put black people in a black or an African race, that's based on things that we can see about them, right? Their skin color usually, and that's linked to biology. So there's almost a hair of truth to this one, depending on how you look at it. But again, that only has to do with some of the physical things that we see, right? The sort of characteristics and intellectual capacities and moral behavior, all that's ridiculous, right? None of that differs according to race. What's B?
Culture. Different culture.
Right. Each race has a distinct culture. Example, language, dress, music, dance, that is also linked to biology. Is that true? Is that true? No, that's ridiculous, right? Because we know that culture isn't passed on biologically, right? Culture is not encoded in your genes. Culture is passed on through enculturation or socialization, right? We're taught that, right? That's our operating system that gets downloaded after we're born. We don't come with our software pre-installed, right? That's not the kind of creature that we are. If so, then I could go to China, I could adopt their little Chinese baby, I could come back here and raise it, and it would be a Chinese person. They wouldn't sort of know or practice Canadian culture, they would practice Chinese culture, if that were the case. But does that make any sense at all? No, that's ridiculous, right? So that's not true either. What about C? Yeah, racial differences are meaningful and unchangeable. Are racial differences meaningful?
Yes, it is.
In what way?
So, like, each race has its distinctive characteristic, but not interchangeably.
Okay, give me a little bit more than that. Because you may be right or you may be wrong. I can't tell yet.
Like unchangeable as the color of skin. Like we can't change it.
Right, so our biological appearance is not changeable, right? That's definitely true. Here I think they're talking about the sort of differences in like intellectual capacity or moral character. So they're saying that, yeah, so a certain group of people, a certain race of people are, you know, dishonest and untrustworthy, and that will never change. They're all like that. That'll never change. Is that true? No. Ridiculous, right? Entire groups of people are not one way or another. And of course, everybody can change their behavior. That's part of what makes humans so successful and adaptable. We can always change our behavior. So that doesn't make any sense either, but it's something people believe. What about D?
Naturally being inferior to others.
Yeah, the idea that some races are naturally inferior. And so not only race-based societies believe that not only is race real and meaningful and that actual people in races are different, but of course some are superior to others, right? Some are more intelligent, more hardworking, more trustworthy, more compassionate than others, right? Is that true? No, right? If any of those things are true, you might be able to say that about a culture, right? You might be able to say that certain cultural values are such that, hard work might be valued, right, or not valued. But you can't say that. That's not a biological difference. And again, races aren't a biological thing. So those characteristics aren't attached to biology, and there's no biological difference. So again, it doesn't work, right? And then finally, the last one is that these racial categories should be written into political and legal and social systems. And so this is kind of the basis of kind of structural racism, right? The idea that society is full of different people, and we need to actually organize society so that those people are either kept separate, or the people who are at the top of the hierarchy remain there, and the people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy also remain there, right? And so race-based societies feel that all of these things are true, and so society should be organized in that way. But of course, I think, as I've been kind of hammering on for a while here, is that none of those things are actually true, right? The science does not back up any of those ideas, right? There's biologically speaking, or at least genetically speaking, we're effectively all the same, right? We have 99% of our DNA is exactly the same, right? We're not different. And the ways in which we're different are not linked to intellectual capacity or moral character or anything like that, right? We vary much more as individuals than we do as entire groups, right? And so they mention that, this is maybe the last thing I'll say, they mention that in the article, right? That we share 99.9% of our DNA with everyone else. And the ways in which we do vary, so that 0.1%, 85% of those differences are just between individuals, right? Only 5 to 10% of it has to do with people of different ancestry. So of the 0.1%, only 10% of that actually has to do with the differences that we have because of the places in the world that we come from. So that's almost nothing, right? And again, some of those genetic differences have come about because of where in the world our genes have evolved. And so it kind of ties us to different parts of the world, right? You look at me or I look at you, and I can maybe guess about where your ancestors have come from. But again, that's not a meaningful biological difference, right? Effectively, biologically speaking, we're all the same person. I don't know if that makes you feel good or not, but but we are. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. Come back tomorrow, we'll finish this article, and then we'll do something else with regard to racism. I can't remember what it is, but it'll be a surprise for both of us, I guess. Okay, that's it. Bye, guys.